Time now for Behind the Headlines and a closer look at some of the stories of the day. The Independent reports on prominent Saudi women's rights activist Loujain al-Hathoul, who was arrested with 12 others in 2018. Her family says her trial's been moved to a terrorism court, where she stands accused of conspiring with foreign organisations. Donald Trump has issued a temporary rule that could mean tourists from 24 countries will have to pay bonds of up to $15,000 before travelling to the US. According to Nairametrics, the rule will target mostly African countries, which have higher rates of overstaying their visas. Scotland has become the first country in the world to make female sanitary products free to anyone who needs them. According to the Scotsman, it's been hailed as a step towards ending period poverty and the stigma of menstruation. And finally, the Daily Mail is fearing the worst, bad pun intended, as potential trade restrictions after Brexit in January could mean British meat products are banned from Europe and vice versa. My lovely reviewers today are French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani and political editor of the Sunday Mirror, Nigel Nelson. Guys, good to have you with us. So let's start with the Saudi activist's trial. This trial has now been moved to a terrorism court. Nigel, this is the case of Loujain al-Hathoul. She was arrested back in May 2018 with a group of other, I think, 12 women's activists.
Yes, that's right. What she was arrested for was that she'd been campaigning for to get the driving ban against women removed. And the day after it was, that she was then under arrest. Now, the charges are basically spying charges, but not many people believe that she's one of hundreds of political prisoners being kept in Saudi jails. What the family were hoping for was that she would be released. And now it seems that Saudi is up the ante, and instead of releasing her, they're sending her to a terrorism tribunal. Obviously, what Saudi could do, if they wanted to show they were serious about human rights, would be to release her, and a lot more pressure will come on to them next year when Joe Biden becomes US president, because he won't be quite so friendly to the human rights abuses going on in Saudi Arabia as Donald Trump was.
Yeah, it does sound like an extraordinarily bad PR decision, doesn't it? Nabila, we've heard a lot about how Mohammed bin Salman's trying to modernise Saudi Arabia, but actually its human rights record is still very questionable.
Yes, and this story brings it into sharp focus. And this is one of those trials that draws the world's attention onto the absolutely appalling human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. Loujain al-Hathoul is rightly of particular interest to the world because she has been nominated for a Nobel Prize and was at the center of the campaign to allow Saudi women to drive. Now, that victory by Loujain has since been reversed, and she now finds herself as a human rights prisoner who is said to have been tortured in prison, and her family says she is now due in court to stand trial for a series of alleged crimes, including destabilizing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, if that sounds like a vague charge, it's because it is. And Loujain was kidnapped from the UAE in March 2018 and deported to Saudi Arabia, where she's now formally arrested along with others. And I well remember how chilling it seemed in June 2018 when Loujain remained in custody, when women were actually granted the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, and there were well-sourced claims.
And we've heard a lot of condemnation by human rights groups about this. But Nigel, really, why should Saudi Arabia change its ways when countries like America and the UK seem quite happy to carry on doing business with it?
Yeah, and I think that's actually the problem, really, that we are happy to carry on doing business with them. And the trouble is that with the arms trade, 40,000 jobs in Britain depend on trade with Saudi Arabia. And as a result, we give them an easy ride. But the trouble is that that's what we shouldn't be doing. So broadly, Saudi at the moment holds the presidency of the G20. And every time people say to them, improve your human rights record, they turn around and say, mind your own business. That's just not good enough.
Let's move on to a story coming out of the US. This is a new rule introduced by Donald Trump in the dying days of his presidency. He's requiring some African tourists and business visitors to pay up to $15,000 in bonds. Nabila, this is 24 countries that might have to pay a bond just to visit the US. What is this about?
Well, the great fear is always that an administration in its death throes will bring in horrific measures. And if you were to choose an administration that is likely to do that, then it would certainly be Donald Trump's. And he's more than bitter and angry after losing the election. And this new measure that requires tourists and business travelers from 15 African countries, and indeed 9 other countries, such as Afghanistan and Iran, to pay a bond of up to $15,000 to get into the US is typical of him. Now, the pilot scheme, which will last 6 months, will of course make it extremely difficult for visitors from these countries, and people often resent having to pay for visas and going through all the bureaucracy and waiting that they're required. But finding $15,000 for what might be a short trip to visit relatives is absolutely outrageous. It makes us all think of Trump's early administration wish to see Muslims travelers banned from entering the US. Now, his administration always made it clear that it was not scared of playing with human lives and indeed making life utterly miserable for those from national backgrounds and cultural backgrounds that he disapproved of. And you might argue that Biden can simply reverse these kind of measures as soon as he gets in. But it's really not as simple as that. Reversal of legislation is extremely complicated and time-consuming, and Biden will have...
Well, this is a temporary rule, so, I mean, one hopes that it will just, you know, it could just be allowed to lapse if the new administration doesn't want it. Nigel, the issue is, says the Trump administration, that people come in on a visa and then they simply overstay their visa, or they disappear. And so that's what they're trying to stop. And that is actually an issue, not just for the US, but for a lot of countries. I mean, is this a sensible way to tackle that?
Well, it's one way of tackling it, I suppose. I mean, what the Trump administration argues is that the people from these 24 countries, 10% of them tend to overstay their visas when they get to the US. The question, what would be interesting to do is to see what Joe Biden does about it. He's not said anything so far, and as you just said, Shirley, that it does expire in June anyway, and it will be very complicated to unravel this. But I doubt very much that if this temporary measure lasts the 6 months, that it'll continue under Joe Biden's presidency.
Let's move on to Scotland. This is a groundbreaking story. Scotland has become the first country in the world to have universal free period products. So girls and women now have a legal right to free access to things like tampons and sanitary pads. Nabila, I imagine that you agree with me that this is a great move.
Well, absolutely. And you do get the impression that Scotland really is trying to make a name for itself as a vibrant, progressive nation, especially as England implodes because of Brexit and combined with the coronavirus pandemic. And this new measure will, of course, be welcomed by millions, and especially women. And being the first country in the world to do anything progressive has to be applauded. And free universal access to period products is superb. It is said that it's the first step to ending the stigma of menstruation, and so is likely to have even global ramifications. And there will be, of course, serial practical considerations. For example, who is going to pay for such an ambitious measure, and indeed how will it be administered effectively? But I think the Scottish sound as though they know what they are doing, and the way things are going, they could end up as a fully independent nation very soon, with a world-beating health service that others would have to learn from. And I think the health of the nation.
Well, let's get Nigel's view on this, because probably coming at it from a different direction, Nigel. You know, the argument against this is that it's going to cost maybe £10 million a year, but as a policy, it's going to be largely welcomed. And I guess the question is, why isn't this done everywhere in the world when 50% of the population would benefit from this policy?
Yeah, actually, Shirley, I think that's right. I mean, it went through the Scottish Parliament by 121 votes to 0. So you can see that there is hardly any opposition to measures like this. I would imagine the same thing would happen with the London Parliament if we tried it here. And yes, other countries could follow suit. And when it comes to the money, it's not really that expensive. You're talking about around $13 million a year to bring in this measure. Britain today announced it's borrowing $500 billion to try and cope with COVID. So something like this is just a drop in the ocean.
Yeah, and just very briefly before we move on, I mean, it's one of those things that we don't like talking about, isn't it? Although, you know, the old joke that if men had periods, you know, the entire workplaces would be geared around the monthly cycle and everything would be free. But do you agree, Nabila, that we don't talk about it, and that's why there is this stigma associated with it?
Yes, indeed, and I think this measure will go a long way in ending that stigma. But I think overall, you know, it falls under, you know, the remit of looking after the health of the nation. And it's undoubtedly one of the most important duty of any government. And it's quite right that Scotland is focusing on this.
Let's move on to the great British banger. British sausages could be banned from Europe unless there's a Brexit trade deal. Nigel, this is a disaster. What's the story?
Well, broadly, we're still trying to complete our trade deal with the EU before Britain finally ends transition on the 31st of December. And what the EU are doing are insisting on rules for uncooked prepared meat, which means it can't be imported into the EU unless it's frozen to below minus 18 degrees centigrade. So what will then happen is, if this is not resolved, not only will our prepared meat products not be allowed in Europe, we will then retaliate and ban German bratwurst and things like that. And this is very much an echo of one of the reasons why Brexit happened. Brexiteers wanted to take back control to get Britain's sovereignty back because we objected to Europe doing things like putting a ban on bendy bananas and cucumbers. They argued that all these things had to be free of abnormal curvature. Now, it's a bit of a myth that actually that happened, but it's one of the reasons that Brexit went through, and suddenly the tables are being turned.
I mean, I have to say, I don't think I've ever knowingly bought a bratwurst. However, I would like to think that I would have the choice of doing so. Nabila, what do you think about all this?
Well, I fully agree with Nigel. I mean, when the British were campaigning for Brexit, they were always highlighting how dastardly Brussels was out to damage their traditional cheddar or Yorkshire bitter. And the headline was always, hands off our cheese or hands off our beer. Now it sounds like the complaint is going to be, what's wrong with our sausages? We want to sell them to you. And I must admit, I mean, I don't eat sausages, but I am told by many British friends that they are the best in the world. And Europe will be missing out massively. I am also told that sausages in countries such as France can be absolutely disgusting. So maybe the British do have a point here. And I'm sure that they won't be bothered about losing some of the horse sausages from the supermarket shelves, for example.
I have to say, I once unwittingly ordered an andouillette sausage in France. And if you don't know what that is, you really don't want me to explain it to you, but please stay away from the andouillette sausages. Very briefly, Nigel, does this all come down to the old issue of the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is something that Joe Biden has talked about? Are we still seeing this as a problem when it comes to making the Brexit deal?
Yes, we are. I mean, if Joe Biden insists on keeping the border open, we're going to have some real problems because we want to stop that happening. At the moment, as far as we can understand, that sources are saying that a trade deal is now 95% there. So let's hope by December the 31st we can actually get this thing through.
Nigel and Nabila, great to have you with me. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this edition of Behind the Headlines.